Tony.
Ah,
Hey,
what happened? That was
I don't
interesting.
know. Yeah, my computer it was like the power went off,
Huh.
but it was only the computer. My lights didn't go off. So I have no idea what that was. That's never happened before.
Well, while you say that, I'm gonna plug my computer into power just so that doesn't happen to me. I do have 95%. Well, anyway,
Let me
we
just make a
continued where we
note.
left off. Yeah.
Uh, why don't I just why don't I just start again? Because nobody gives a shit about my COVID anyway. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
and we didn't get in too far. I don't know what that was, so hopefully it won't happen again. But if it does, I'll just restart and come back. That was fucking weird.
I don't see you on video, by the way.
Oh, okay. That's strange. So why not? What the fuck? Sorry about this.
No worries. I'm actually gonna grab my blazer here. I don't know if it's gonna make me look too funny, but I just am a little chilly in this room.
Your blazer.
Let me see if this looks too ridiculous. I just needed something to look to be warm.
For some reason, this camera's not working. God damn it. This is this is a pain in the ass. Where is this? Why is this not working? Still no camera, right?
Still no camera. Oh wait, I see something.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, that was just I turned off the camera. Um, it's not recognizing my camera. Oh, wait, here we go. Anchor. There we go.
there you
Now,
go.
now it found it. All right. Okay. Here we are. I'm back with Tony Brasunas. We had some technical issues there, but hopefully we got them ironed out. So we were talking about, we had just started talking about what it's like to write books. And you said after finishing your first book about your experiences in China, you sort of promised yourself you'd never do it again. I've also published two books, and after both of them, I've been like, never again. I feel like it's kind of like having a baby. Like I imagine women after they have a baby, they're like, fuck that, never again. But then you forget all the agony and you remember the good parts.
Yeah, I mean, evidently for women, and I can't say personally. I'd have to have my wife on here to comment on it personally. But there is some genetic or biological thing that kicks in and actually blocks memories of the pain of childbirth. I think because otherwise women would never have a second child, maybe not even a first child. So
Yeah.
there's something benign going on there, and maybe it's the same for writers. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I read a thing a few months ago, a line. You know how sometimes you'll just read a quote and it sticks with you and it keeps coming up over and over in different sort of, it's like a prism to help you understand different situations. This line was nostalgia is memory without the detail.
Ah,
I feel like that applies to so much, right? You
yeah.
know, we remember things, we leave out. I mean, I think about, if I think about Thailand, I'm thinking about great food and, warm and swimming on the beach. I totally forget about the sandflies. I forget about the stuff in the water, the little jellyfish that are stinging me when I swim in the water. You just forget about all the little irritations, the mosquitoes and the bullshit, but you just remember without all that detail.
It sort of gets into a philosophical question, right? This sort of the age-old question of, is life, more pleasure than pain, right? Is life overall better? Are the good parts better than the bad parts? And I think there's all kinds of things where go both ways. I mean, there's ways in which I heard something where like the mind registers negative comments 7 times more than positive comments.
Hmm.
So you actually need to get 7 compliments for every insult to feel sort of like you're on an even keel, which is
Right.
really unfortunate for human spirit, right? So it would be better if it was reversed, right? Where you could just sort of hear 7 insults and get 1 compliment and just be right on your way. But that's not how we work. So it is interesting that the memory, yeah, it's true. Memory somehow blocks out some of the bad stuff so that we want to keep going, I guess. I heard another quote about nostalgia that it's a longing for things that never were.
Hmm. Yeah, I resist that. I mean, I think that, a lot of the work that I've done, the books that I've written are about prehistory. And I think there's a bias, a lot of the way people sort of shoot from the hip when they hear some of my arguments is, oh, yeah, people have always been saying it was better before. Every generation says, oh, the golden age, the lost time of, where everything was wonderful. And the thing is, any kind of nuanced discussion of prehistory is never saying everything was wonderful. There were serious problems. But I think that there is an argument to be made, and I've made it ad nauseum, some would say, that there is a natural context for a species. And just like dogs want to live like wolves because they are wolves on some level,
Mm-hmm.
we are most comfortable in a hunter gatherer context because that's where we came from. That's the environment that shaped us as a species. And so looking into a campfire is deeply relaxing for human beings because our ancestors have been doing that for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, right? And
Yeah.
so there is a trajectory and there is a context in which things are most appropriate. I'm going off on a rant here. That's why this podcast is called Tangentially Speaking, because I can't keep a fucking thread going. But I do think this whole nostalgia, at least when it's used against me for a time that never existed, that time did exist. It still does exist. There's a reason hunter gatherers aren't clamoring to become farmers, and farmers, in fact, often wander off and try to become hunter gatherers. There's actual data about this. But anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. What you were in China for how long?
So I was there the first time I went was 90 was for a year and a few months in the late 90s, sort of dates myself. That was right when I was coming out of college. And I went and taught English for a year and then just sort of set off on my own backpacking through the country. And yeah, it totally changed my life, transformed how I view. I mean, I called the book Double Happiness because I first of all, because it's a famous Chinese phrase and has lots of different context and texture to it, but also because I discovered a different kind of happiness that I had never really known existed. And so it really changed my life.
Or what
And so I
described
wrote the
that
book to try to
happiness?
share that with others. Go
Right.
ahead.
What was that happiness? And dig into the nuance of the phrase a little bit, please.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously it's a book. I wrote a book, so I'll try to condense it. But so double happiness in Chinese, it's a character that's made from taking two of the character for happiness and sort of smashing them together, and then you have this. It's an actual word, double happiness, sort of meaning the union of happiness, and it's used a lot around weddings. Sort of, it has a lot of meaning around like the joining of things brings happiness and stuff like that. So you'll see double happiness a lot around weddings. You'll also see it. It's like it's a famous enough character that it's like parts of brands of major companies and stuff like that. But the reason that I chose that title for the book. And there is a moment in the book where I sing at a wedding, and it's this ridiculous scenario where I'm sort of this like animal on it stage. I'm an awful singer, but they want me to sing at this wedding, so like that. But no, I wrote the book because as I went off into the hinterlands and sort of everything was stripped away and all of my sort of preconceptions of who I was were no longer meaningful. No one had any expectation of who I was. Also, I was had to communicate in a different language, which was difficult to learn, but I was able to pick it up and start communicating with people. And I'm traveling out in the middle of nowhere, and I discover this other happiness. To try to put into words, it's basically realizing the beauty and perfection of what already is. So we have the one happiness, which is our desires fulfilled, right? And that is a real happiness, to long for something, to dream for it, to understand to have a dream and to push for it. That is a real happiness, and there's no reason to not hold that in high regard. But there's another happiness that I found is more prevalent in China than it is that I experienced it in the United States, in people experiencing a contentment or a awareness and a pleasure in what already is.
Mm. So, given that cultural difference, do you think that yearning, that ambition for progress, to make things better, to constantly be improving things, do you think that that's a cultural aspect of particularly American consciousness, or do you think that that's an innate human thing?
I think it's some of each. I think a lot of these things are innate um, things, but that the story about the Native American and the two wolves, and you feed which one you want to thrive. It's sort of that. I think these things are there, sort of latent in human nature, in the same sense that we're both competitive and cooperative. And right,
Mm,
if you just think we're competitive, you'll lose sight of the cooperative side of human nature. If you just think we're cooperative, you'll lose sight of the competitive side.
right.
I think it's like that. I mean, I think we are both driven to be more than we are, and to get more, and to compete, and to go for more. But we're also just as much, and I think this is what so many of the poets and the philosophers and the artists are trying to tell us, is that there's more here. There's unity in addition to division, right? There's this sort of ineffable joy and awareness of existence that sort of is a background and sort of pre-exists all of the craziness that we go through in life, which is legitimate too, right? There's the hierarchy of needs, and we have to sort of achieve them and things like that. But yeah, and so I think it is cultural to an extent, which ones we emphasize,
Mm,
which things we tell our kids, even not through words, but through how we live, that we teach our children to how to be a human being, really what it means to be alive.
yeah, yeah, and travel is invaluable in that. Just getting in that situation where things that you can't see things until you change the backdrop. There's so many things that just blend in and they're invisible until you place yourself in some totally alien environment, and then suddenly you're noticing things that have been there all along, but you never noticed them. Yeah, yeah, traveling is amazing. I've never been to China. I've spent a lot of time in Asia, but um, China never really attracted me. It was always like a huge hassle to go there, and um, it just the Chinese culture just sort of seemed brutal and kind of gross in a lot of ways, like in terms of like what they eat, and it's very urban, and just I don't know, it just never appealed to me. I would like go to Nepal 10 times before I would go to China, but maybe I'm
Well,
just
yeah.
an
So read
idiot.
my book, read Double Happiness. I mean, there's an element of what you're saying that is sort of a media perception of China.
Mm,
Not to say that isn't true. I mean, China is an urban culture in some ways. There's huge, huge cities, like cities you've never heard of, with 5 million people and things like
right.
that. But no, it's a vast country with just beautiful scenery and mountains and tiny and villages far flung, and there's Muslim areas, Tibetan areas, there's the Mongolian areas. I mean, it's really three countries in a way. You have sort of the coast, which is really the sort of modern China that everybody thinks about, the big cities. And now it's way more modern even than it was the last time I was there. Last time I was there was in 2013. But then you have this sort of middle China, which is sort of more farming, and there's still big cities, but it's much more sort of a rolling farmland. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
painting with a really broad brush. It's a diverse country. It's a huge country.
Yeah.
And when you get out to the west, it's really like there's not a ton of people, really, and it's these huge areas, huge mountains, tall plateaus, deserts, and it's just there's more, to explore than you can imagine. So
What do you think about what's happening now with the riots? Is this as um, unusual and potentially pivotal a moment as a lot of commentators are suggesting?
yeah, so we can sort of jump off into a little bit the political stuff and how Red, White, and Blind came about at this point. I mean, I when I wrote Double Happiness, it's funny, like even in Double Happiness, there's very few passages that really touch on politics. I didn't really focus on it too much. I had a fairly, I think, naive perception of the media and of the American government and the Chinese government to some extent. I finished that and I came back to the United States, and that's when I started really paying attention to the media. I went back to China. I was there in 2001 is when it was, when the spy plane went down. I don't know if you remember this incident, but there was this American spy plane that went down over Hainan Island, which is this island right off the coast of China that's a Chinese island. And it was this big kerfuffle. And, the Chinese said it was, why are you spying on us? And the Americans were like, why did you shoot down our plane? And they're like, we didn't shoot it down, but we could have and should have if we wanted to. And, it went back and forth. And I was there, and this is a chapter in Red, White, and Blind. I was there, and it was the first time I really noticed. I was able to go into a little internet cafe because the internet was a thing in 2001. It wasn't a big thing, but it was a thing for sure. And I could read the New York Times or CNN online. And then I could go and just sort of go to a little newsstand and buy a Chinese newspaper with my dictionary. I could read through the newspaper. And it was just a completely different story. And that was part of
Mm.
my awakening about media distortion and media. And that was the beginning of it all, realizing the level of distortion. And at that time, I was still in this mentality that the Chinese media is heavily propagandized and distorted, and the American media is truthful. But I started to see there were some cracks in that. And then I came back to San Francisco, and I can get into the whole story of the next 10 years of my life that led to Red, White, and Blind. But to get to your question, yeah, so I think China is an amazing country and it's a beautiful place, and we want nothing to do with their government system or their media system. I mean, it's really bad. They never went through the Enlightenment, and we can get into that. They never went through this revolution of the individual and a notion of individual rights. That's a powerful and important thing. It's the sort of underlying philosophy is Confucianism and to some extent Taoism and Buddhism, and that's basically like the society stability of the society is more important than freedom of the individual. And those things are shifting, but that still is fairly prevalent. It's a really interesting conversation to get into. So yeah, I mean, with the way China handled COVID and the way that what's going on there now, I've been horrified. I mean, and I was horrified to the extent that, some of the media narrative in this country went, I mean, I've had people in my family who were like, oh, I think kind of China got it right. People were saying that back in like 2000, like, what China was doing was essentially like authoritarianism on steroids. And it did set a trend around the world to some extent, like where
Mm.
Australia went and even places like Italy. No, I think that's horrifying to me, and absolutely we should oppose it, and we should insist on individual freedoms, freedom of speech, freedoms of one thing we don't have in our constitution. I wish we did, and they have it, I think, in the Danish constitution, a few others, is in addition to freedom of speech, freedom of press, religion, freedom of movement. It's not actually declared in the U.S. Constitution, so the idea that you could be locked down while never having happened ever in history. The quarantines in the Middle Ages were quarantines of sick people. We've never locked down healthy people. That's never been done. And that there should be a constitutional amendment or something passed that, you were just saying how important travel is. I mean, the ability to travel is a fundamental human right, the ability to move around. And it's horrifying in places that don't have it, like here and like China. There's this possibility that they can presume to tell you can't leave your house. Yeah.
To push back a little bit on that, there are places where you can't travel without inoculations, right?
Yeah.
You need your yellow fever card, you need your dengue card or whatever it is. Um, yeah, that question of travel and freedom of movement is interesting. COVID, in some ways, I feel like even though it's been so disruptive and difficult and led to all sorts of problems and including death for millions of people, it feels like it was kind of a practice run, right? If it had been Ebola,
Mhm.
um, it would have been a lot different. These questions that we're almost able to look at as theoretical philosophical questions at this point, like, is the right to movement an absolute human right or not? With something like Ebola, that would take on a different hue, I think. I just read yesterday that as the permafrost melts in the Arctic, all sorts of viruses and bacteria are being released that have been preserved in the ice for tens of thousands of years, many of them infectious. So we may be in for like wave after wave after wave of this stuff. Uh,
Well, certainly, and yeah, and certainly the news will always have the next thing to terrify us. That's what
sure.
they're good at. Is here's the next thing to be scared of. Oh, you're not scared of that anymore? Here's something to be scared about. Um,
Exactly.
that will always be there.
Yeah.
That's not under threat. No, I mean, we could get into it. Yeah, I think the freedom of movement, and I mean, some of the models that came out, Ferguson in the UK. I mean, he just absolutely based on no science came up with this model that if we do what Sweden does, if Sweden does what they're going to do, 10 million people are going to die, 20 million people are going to die. If we don't do this in the UK, 30 million people are going to die, and those models are way off and absolutely battered and destroyed a lot of people's livelihood, and absolutely got it way wrong. And you look back, and they had no science they based it on. They based it on some strange desire to, I mean, I think the thing to really think about is when you have, governments want more power. That's what they want. They want more power generally. And so if you look at the ability to say, oh, here's a reason we can take more power. Let's try locking people down, see if that works, see if they'll get away with that. And there's stuff that's come out, in France and in England, stuff like, oh, we could never get away with what they did in China. And then they tried it in Italy, and they're like, oh, look, they got away with it. Maybe we can do this. And then you look at Sweden, and what they said was going to happen didn't happen. 10 million people didn't die. They ended up having, roughly the same level of casualties as other countries in Europe. So yeah, I mean, we could get into it. I think it's pretty terrifying, to be honest, how close you can get to that. Yeah, if the disease is Ebola, then maybe it's a different conversation. But every virus will have its own natural evolution, and viruses will tend to evolve to be more infectious and less deadly, because if they're deadly, they kill the host and they stop spreading. So then that's what's happened with COVID, is it becomes more infectious and less deadly. Not saying it's good. One of the things I do in Red, White, and Blind is I open the book with what I call nonpartisan stories, because I don't want this book to be seen as like, this is the Democrat view of censorship and misinformation, or this is the Republican view of, because it's a much deeper issue than that. And so the first story I open with is Epstein and the Jeffrey Epstein story, and how, just the worst thing you can imagine, right? I mean, basically, for a quarter of a century, this pedophilia rape ring is abducting girls and abusing them by the hundreds, probably by the thousands, and gets away with it for 25 years. I mean, it's just absolutely abhorrent. It wasn't because somebody was a Democrat or Republican. It's a much deeper issue. The second issue I get into is the origin of the virus, right? And like why, and I think this is a nonpartisan issue. I've had a little bit of pushback on this, but I don't think so. I mean, why were we not able to discuss in the media the origin of the virus? For the entire first year and a half, 2 years, you were unable to actually say, maybe this came out of that lab that's just down the street from the wet market. And I looked at every news article, for a year, it was just, you can't even say it. That's a wild, crazy conspiracy theory. That's a racist theory. I mean, everything. Now we'll never know for certain. Maybe it's 99% sure it came out of the lab. I mean, there's almost no, even to say it's 50-50 though, is still, in like the New York Times, they still don't run stories that are 50-50. They'll just kind of allow that maybe it's a possibility. So that too, that's not because it's a Democrat or Republican thing. There's a deeper bias in our media that cloaks certain issues, that cloaks the ability to discuss certain issues. And that's really what I want people to see. And that's what Red, White, and Blind is all about.
So, what is that bias? Is it corporate power? Is it, Christo-fascist right-wing media empire? Sinclair Network and Fox News and Rupert Murdoch and all that? Is it sensationalism, as you referred to earlier? Just hey, this is scary, that's scary, this is a threat, that's a threat. What is the essence? Because I see lots of bias. I see bias like currents in a swirling part of the ocean, right? There's bias running in many different directions. What are you specifically referring to?
Yeah, so I get into it. There's several kinds of bias, and I distinguish three kinds of bias in the book that I think are important to understand. Because you're right, there's all kinds of stuff, and people use this word in all different ways. I also get into what disinformation, misinformation, fake news, what those labels refer to, what censorship is and what it isn't, and what propaganda is. So bias, there's three kinds of bias. The first kind of bias is innocent bias. Innocent bias is like the bias you have because of what you do for a living, where you grew up, your race, your class, your gender, national origin,
Hmm.
all of that kind of stuff. And we all have it. We all bring, I'm going to look at issues a certain way because of where I live and who I am and how I grew up and all of that kind of stuff. Privilege, not privilege, all that kind of stuff is innocent bias. It's a real issue. It's a problem in a sense. Like you don't want to balance. I talk a lot about a balanced media diet, and we can get into that. You don't want to have your entire media diet all people with the same innocent bias. So that would be like all people that look one way, or all people that come from the same place, or have the same, socioeconomic background or something.
All people who like Twitter.
Yeah, right. Whatever it is. All people that like peanut butter, whatever it is. Um, so that's innocent bias, and that's the thing we can get into. I think most people get that without having to discuss it too much. The next one is systemic bias. And so systemic bias is the bias that comes from where you work, when you, or what organization you're publishing your news through, right? So because we're at a place in history in the United States press where five giant corporations own basically all of the media that money can buy, which is like 95% of what you hear if you're not trying to find independent media, if you're not looking for, podcasts that have fascinating people discussing interesting issues on them, you're going to be hearing things and reading things and seeing things that come through these giant corporations, and they have very intense bias of what is allowed to be talked about and what isn't, what perspective it should be talked about and what perspective it shouldn't be. So in systemic bias, I even get into five separate filters of systemic bias, and this borrows on some of the work of Noam Chomsky and in manufacture of consent. There's the filter of advertisers, what they want or don't want in there. There's the filter of elite sources. You don't question elite sources because you could jeopardize your access to them. There's the dominant narrative filter. So if like there's a dominant narrative like the war on terror or like the dangerous pandemic or whatever the dominant narrative is, you can't really go against the dominant narrative or it'll be filtered. So that's systemic bias, very important and fascinating to understand. I spent a whole chapter or two on that. And then the third one is nefarious bias. And this is bias that comes through actual manipulation, deliberate manipulation of news. So systemic bias often isn't deliberate. It's like the journalist that happens to get promoted will be writing things that passes through the filters. They might not know that they're biased and censored or self-censoring, but they are. And the one that, really wanted to write about, the Iraq war from this perspective and then just didn't get promoted. And that's interesting. And then they ended up not in a job when there was like layoffs, right?
Chris
Things
Hedges.
like that happen. Yeah, that's systemic bias. Nefarious bias is like I spent a chapter on Operation Mockingbird, right? So that we know happened or is still happening. That's the CIA operation that came out in the 1970s with the Church Committee basically saying, for 30 years, 25, 30 years, the CIA was placing either recruiting journalists or placing agents at major media institutions. Some of the most famous journalists were part of this program, and they would disseminate propaganda. Basically, they would bias what they were saying one direction or the other. They would actually just, drop in false narratives. And so that's the difference with nefarious bias is that there's always an ulterior agenda, and it's always done deliberately rather than non-deliberately. So then the question with nefarious bias is it still going on? Because they say that they stopped doing Operation Mockingbird, and I get into some of the CIA documents, and It's almost certainly still going on. It's probably much, much more prevalent now than it was then. So those are the three kinds of bias, and to understand that's where this stuff is happening. And so I tell a bunch of stories: Epstein, origin of the virus. Then we go into a bunch of other stories that sort of illustrate these different types of bias.
So it's interesting, framing these things, because I feel like, as you were talking about nefarious bias and Operation Mockingbird, I don't know if it's still going on or not, or if it's just become obvious.
Yeah.
James Woolsey, former head of the CIA, is now a paid commentator on MSNBC, I believe, right? So he's on MSNBC all the time on different shows, fucking David Petraeus and, all these guys, former generals, former CIA, former FBI, they're openly paid commentators on networks. Isn't that like what they were doing, in a hidden sort of way 20 years ago? Now it's just out in the open.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And yeah, I mean, there's a study, I think it was done by Fairness, Accuracy, and Reporting or something like that, about build up to the Iraq War. And they basically looked at all of the sources that were on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, CBS, PBS. And it was something like, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. It's in the book, but it was like of 250 sources that came on to sort of talk about whether we should, what we should do in Iraq. There were like 6 that were against war, and of those appearances, it was like 2 were Dennis Kucinich. One was like, some Iranian or Iraqi professor, something that managed to squeeze on there. And then you had like, yeah, dozens of appearances by actual CIA, defense intelligence, all of these people, and that stuff goes on and is even more so. So yeah, so I definitely talk about that. That's a part of it, but like you were saying, that's actually just overt now. They're not even hiding it. It's like, oh, let's hear from the CIA what they happen to think about this particular issue. And that's important, but that's not exactly nefarious bias. I mean, the fact that that guy is placed there is actually systemic bias. I mean, that guy is just, he's on MSNBC or CNN because he's going to say the right things around the right narrative, and it's not hidden. Nefarious bias would be, like I talk about the issue. There was a instance right before the 2020 election where there was Russia was supposedly paying bounties to
Mm,
Afghans to attack Americans.
right.
And this story was reported in the New York Times with very shady sources, like unnamed intelligence sources. And then it was repeated in the Washington Post. Turns out now it was totally false. That wasn't going on. There was not, and they walked it back, 6 months later. But that's an instance of nefarious bias because there's, a story is just sort of placed. This is how a narrative is. I say sort of how to bake a narrative. It's often done like this, where there's these sort of very vaguely sourced articles, probably coming from some intelligence thing with an ulterior agenda. The agenda is not clear in the article, and then one source reports it, and then Operation Mockingbird was called Mockingbird because of the idea that one source could sort of call out their song, and then the other ones would hear and repeat,
Right.
right? And so then suddenly you've got this whole thing, and it's a really great technique. I mean, in a sort of cynical way, because of 2 things. First of all, you don't need this sort of back channel shady conversation that could eventually get revealed. That it's like, yeah, I'm going to write this on Tuesday, Washington Post right on Wednesday, LA Times on Thursday. You don't have to have that conversation because it's just the Mockingbirds. The other thing is it really preys upon a part of human psychology that propaganda really depends on, which is this idea that if you hear something once or maybe even twice, the brain's kind of like, yeah, I don't really think that's true. I don't know. But if
Right.
you hear something 7, 8, 9 times from different sources, the brain just sort of incorporates it like, oh yeah, I guess that's what's going on.
Right.
So Operation Mockingbird, it's a really great technique, and that's certainly, you can observe that in the media. So that's how a narrative it's planted in the media through these sort of intelligence unsourced things. Then the mockingbirds sing about it. Then we get into, so then people start to believe it, even though it's probably not true. People start to get it, and then you have different kinds of censorship, which is, so there's the systemic censorship, which basically you can't go against that narrative. Then you have fact checking. So the fact checkers step in. The fact checkers will remove anything counter to that. And then you have social media censorship, and then social media censorship will also remove or shadow ban sources that go against it. And so that's where we're at. We're in a very sophisticated media environment right now, which in some ways is pretty dark. Like, it looks pretty like, how are we going to ever get around this? They have all these really intense vehicles. And so what I write about in Red, White, and Blind is there's a very powerful countervailing force right now, which is very exciting. And we're in what I would call a new enlightenment, because what's going on is much like the invention of the movable type printing press in the 1400s that birthed the first enlightenment. I mean, it toppled power because it and that allowed people to read and to write and eventually to publish and to distribute ideas much, much more broadly, that eventually toppled the power of the Catholic Church and the feudal system. The internet is the same type of an invention. In fact, I would say it's probably even more. We'll have to look at it again in 100 years to see if it's going to be even more powerful than the printing press. But we're in like the second phase of the second quarter of a 4-quarter game here of what the internet is bringing to humanity. And I think we're in the process of a new enlightenment. And so you see a very similar phenomenon where the existing distribution of information, the sort of arbiters of truth and fiction, their power is waning. And so just like the Catholic Church, when people sort of say, I think maybe the Earth isn't the center of the galaxy. I don't, there's a lot of science that's showing that that's not the case. You're on the rack. You're a heretic. You're a blasphemer. But then eventually that type of suppression loses. And so we're in a similar phase, right? Where you could see with some of the COVID narratives, you could see with like the thing about Jeffrey Epstein, with all of these different stories where the truth comes out in independent media and they try to silence it and they try to hush it and they try to do all these things, and they have a lot of sophisticated techniques, and it's a very interesting information war. But little by little, even the label today is conspiracy theorist, or like all these kinds of negative terms that are used to say don't do your own research, don't read, don't think for yourself, but people are doing it anyway. And so we're in this fabulous phase, and that's what really Red, White, and Blind is about. Is we're all in a state of red, white, and blind. All of us are deceived by this crazy media behemoth, but we have in our own hands the power to awaken. And what I call media consciousness is this idea to start to look at not just what's being said, but who's saying it and why, and what do they want us not to see, and what do they want me to feel. When I read this article, when I read about the tundra is thawing and all these viruses are coming out, what do they want me to feel about that? And why? Doesn't mean it's false, doesn't mean it's true. It's just the media consciousness is to think about it and then maybe have another source and to balance our media diet. So sorry to go off on it, but that's
No,
sort of where I see it. Yeah.
that's good. You say the internet and its unprecedented access to information is enabling universal human connection, which is true. Interesting. Revealing long hidden aspects of reality and dethroning entrenched arbiters of truth. This is a wild epoch taking us kicking and screaming into a brighter and more truthful future. Okay, interesting. But how is this any different from, you say do your own research, and there's the opportunity to awaken, there's the opportunity to overthrow the traditional arbiters of truth, and yet the zone is being flooded with bullshit, right? Yeah. We've got flat earthers. We've got Alex Jones claiming that the Sandy Hook kids weren't really dead and their grieving parents are fucking actors. The zone is flooded with so much bullshit. And maybe this is, I don't know, is this nefarious? Is this systemic? I don't know what the generating force behind this is necessarily, but it feels like wake up sounds easy, but when you've got unlimited sources of information, each one of which has questionable validity, who's got the fucking time for this, right? One of the reasons we had the arbiters of truth is that they did the research. Supposedly, they were fucking Walter Cronkite wasn't going to lie to us, supposedly. And there were like limited but higher quality sources of information, and now it's unlimited lower quality sources of information. So how the fuck are we supposed to wake up? Who's got time for this?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. So The first thing to do, and this is basically what I say. So yeah, there's going to be two sort of hobgoblins on our path. One is going to be this sense of like overwhelm, and one is going to be cynicism when we realize how bad the problem is, right? And those are serious issues to overcome. The first thing I say is that media consciousness, which is what I say is the right path to get on to this path of media consciousness, is not only by trying to attain some level of media consciousness, not only are you going to be able to decipher truth from fiction a little bit better, you're going to start to hone your own integrity versus bullshit detectors, right? There's all kinds of side benefits to this. So one benefit is that you'll be able to connect with more people. A lot of times we end up, the media as it is, the media establishment as it is dividing people, is pushing us into these camps with the red camp and the blue camp, and with these two tribes, and people are losing connection with their friends and family over this. And so that is, I've experienced it myself. I think so many people I talk to have experienced this, where I don't feel like my beliefs neatly map onto what the Democrats say or the Republicans say. I have maybe different views on abortion or guns or the vaccines or like whatever controversial issue or whatever it is, right? So by moving towards media consciousness, we can begin to connect with others because we'll understand those other viewpoints. Even if we don't necessarily agree with them, say, okay, that's another viewpoint. Another big advantage is we don't have any other option. There is no, I'm not going to inhale kind of option. Like you can't just sort of opt out. This stuff, this media disinformation, the dissemination of propaganda and the censorship, it's been going on for 100 years now. I mean, the birth of propaganda coincided with the birth of this idea of objective news, which doesn't exist. It's sort of a fiction that there could be objective news. We can get into that. That all that stuff came out of the 1920s. That led to the phase where we are now, which is falling apart, but it's this consolidation of media ownership into 5 giant hands, which is essentially a ministry of truth, right? And it's so powerful. The management of the narratives is so sophisticated. We can't just choose to opt out. I mean, you can try to like put earplugs in and go about your life for a day or two, but eventually it still seeps in. You still absorb, this is what the dangerous pandemic is, or this is what happened on January 6th, or this is what happened on, September 11th, or whatever it is. There's so many things. And then even if you somehow manage to avoid that, it comes in through your friends and family, right? So we don't have a not inhale. This is the water we swim in. This media environment, the narrative is not just, did or did not some event happen. It's literally the story of our lives. It's what we are to hope for and what we are to fear. I believe that this deception that comes from the media is the most powerful type of deception that affects us in our lives today. And so we have to address it one way or the other, right? I mean, we can stick our head in the sand, or we can say, now maybe awaken is too big of a word, right? Media consciousness is the idea that little by little, we can begin to see not just what's being said, but who's saying it and why. And a balanced media diet allows us to begin to move towards this path of media consciousness. So balanced media diet is, I come up with the book. I went through hundreds of sources. Here's 40 sources that I recommend. I don't think everything that every one of them says is true. Unfortunately, there's no Santa Claus. I can't tell you there's one source that always tells you the truth. I wish I could. And even if I did, it'd probably change. It'd be co-opted or something like that in 2023, right? So, but by going towards media consciousness and following a balanced media diet, and there's several levels. So if you say, how do I have time for this? There's one level where it's 30 minutes a day. Hopefully people can do that. Maybe they can't. There's another level that's an hour a day. And there's like, if you really want to nerd out and become a media philosopher, there's 2 hours a day with, and there's just more sources that you sort of look at each day. And the idea is, and I do say, let's say it just feels overwhelming. And I've had people, because I'm following my media diet, I've talked to people that are doing it, and they're like, it's just more than I can handle. Then what I say is then pick an issue or two. So rather than like, if you're on the 30-minute plan, there's 2 sources each day and it changes each day of the week. And then you come back on Monday to the ones from last Monday. Instead of reading everything, just pick an issue that you really want to know about. Maybe it's the war in Ukraine, or maybe it's, COVID something, or it's whatever it is. And so then when you go through your balanced media diet sources, you just look at that issue. Because the important thing is to be informed, but deeper than becoming informed is learning to understand narratives and learning to see, okay, this is how they're talking about this issue.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's what I say. Your question's a great one. That's exactly the right question. Yeah, like how do we deal with it? And how do we deal with the fact that, right, there's so much out there. And this is the temptation towards censorship is, well, can't we just get rid of Alex Jones because he says some disgusting stuff? Or can't we just get rid of this person who says disgusting stuff? And this is where I draw a line and I say, well, let's talk about what free speech is, what free speech really means. And Noam Chomsky is really eloquent on this. He says free speech is not supporting speech that you like or you agree with, because, you know, Hitler and Stalin loved that kind of free speech. Everybody loves more and more speech that they agree with. Supporting free speech is supporting speech that you despise,
Right.
that you are disgusted by,
And that
not
used to
because it's
be
good.
that used to
Yeah,
be common knowledge. I mean,
yeah,
I remember when I was a kid, I'm 60, so I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Every
yeah,
kid knew that phrase. Every kid said that phrase. You insult somebody, you'd say that sticks and stones can break my bones, but fuck off.
yeah.
Now, like, where'd that go? It's gone
Now
now.
it's, I know, it's like microaggressions. It's like sticks and
Yeah,
stones can hurt my bones, and microaggressions are going to get you kicked out of school.
I don't feel safe, so it's your
Yeah,
problem. Like, what?
I
What are you
know.
talking about? Um, yeah, I mean, this is interesting, and I find this as a writer myself, and also when I'm looking at other people's work. Sometimes it's like things are both profound and utterly obvious, right? Like what you're talking about in this book is very important. It's timely, it's topical, it's crucial to a functioning democracy, and at the same time, it's totally obvious. Like,
Yeah,
how
I
is this
know.
any different from critical thinking? How is this any
I was
different?
writing the book. I was like, all this stuff, it writes itself. Like, I think this used to be just basic ideas of, and I
Right.
realize now I'm a classical liberal. I thought I was a progressive, and I talk about progressivism and what that means. I think I'm just a liberal from, like, you know, the early 20th century who believes that we shouldn't have censorship and believes in, you know, free speech and the Constitution, these things. Now it's like I don't know where I am. I'm politically homeless. And I feel
Yeah.
like my book just wrote itself. I don't feel like it's like rocket science. But anyway, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
You know, I lived in Spain for 20 years, and a lot of what you're talking about in terms of, you know, questioning your sources and developing your bullshit detectors and all that kind of stuff, to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, I think a lot of that is honed by travel, right? Because what you're doing is you're saying, oh, all this stuff I thought was like accepted truth is actually a particular culture's way of framing reality. So it
Mm,
could be travel, it could be psychedelics, it could be meditation, it could be all sorts of things that shift your sort of your point of view so that you see things from different angles, right? And whenever we talk about propaganda, two things come to mind. First of all, Edward Bernays, who I guess you're familiar with, and his work in the 20s, and him being Freud's nephew, and, you know, just like that whole axis of freak out. But also in Spain, propaganda is what Spanish people call advertising.
hmm.
And that's just, I mean, it's not even a slang. It's like, oh, the propaganda for Coca-Cola, you know, is on the TV. It's like, and I love that. When the first time I heard that, I thought, that's so cool. They know it's propaganda. They know it's bullshit, right? It's like, instead of saying advertising, say bullshit, because that's what it is, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No, I love what you say. I think that's you did a great job there of like knitting together my history as a writer, which I maybe didn't know how to do. Yeah, there's an element to which a balanced media diet is like travel. I love that. It's sort of this idea of like, yeah, we all have our viewpoint, and we all think we're right. I mean, that's part of the nature of the, you know, the human brain, and we don't like to admit that we're wrong. And, you know, it's easier to fool someone than to convince them they've been fooled, and that whole thing. But what if you travel, you know? And if you can't, maybe travel doesn't mean, you know, grab a suitcase and get on the plane and go to China. Maybe it means read the other side's news sources, read
Hang out with
foreign
a Trump
news.
supporter.
Yeah, talk to a Trump supporter, or if you're a Trump supporter, talk to a, you know, a CNN junkie. You know,
Yeah.
like, and I've been on podcasts on both sides, and it's really interesting to talk to people on both sides. Yeah, I love that. Just be open-minded a little bit, and travel helps. And if you can't, if you're not going to travel, read broadly. Reading used to be considered a great thing. Now it's like, don't do your own research. Like, where did that happen? No, do your own research. Jesus, that's what we need to do. Read, learn, think. You might be wrong. A lot of us are wrong. We'll all be wrong some of the time. I'm wrong some of the time. Um, but talk about it, think. That's what gets us through. That's the foundation of science and democracy and these ideas that undergird Western civilization. We need to hold those and defend those. If science becomes just trust the experts, or democracy becomes, just vote for your party, we're back to the dark ages. That's what the priests wanted. Just
That
trust us. We've got
that's
the
one
truth.
of
Trust us.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's one of the supreme ironies of all this, right? Is the sort of undercutting of scientific authority, particularly around COVID and big pharma and all that, because what you're talking about is essentially applying the scientific method to your media consumption,
that's right.
right? It's don't go into it assuming you know what's right. Look at different things, compare them, run tests, have a control group, have objective observers, and now you analyze the data. I mean, it's undercutting the legitimacy of science, not necessarily specific scientists who are um, motivated by professional ambition and money, and there's all sorts of reasons that individual scientists and even scientific journals that don't publish negative results, they only publish the stuff that works for their advertisers. I mean, it's been corrupted, there's no doubt about it, but the scientific method itself is the best thing we've got as far as distinguishing reality from not reality.
Absolutely. And it's literally, it is the underpinning of science and democracy. Democracy is the same. Like the idea that you let everybody in the room say their ideas. Everybody's got lots of ideas, and you let the best ideas win. And you don't censor anybody. If their ideas are bad, then somebody gets up there and says those ideas are bad, and here's why. And that's it. That's the best thing we've got, right? If we had, if we knew this guy over here is divinely omniscient and has, then yeah, sure, let's have a what do they call it, the benign monarchy,
Mm,
enlightened despotism, right? Yeah,
yeah.
that would be the best form of government. If we knew we had an enlightened despot, let him or her or it run the show.
Yeah.
But we don't have that. And so we've got science and democracy, which are crazy, chaotic systems full of misinformation, full of bad actors. We're trying to, make an omelet out of a bunch of rotten eggs or something like that. But that's the best we've got. That's what we have to do, is we have to figure out, how do you come up with a system that takes self-interested people and comes out with a relatively reasonable approximation of the truth. And that's what we've got to go with, because the alternative is so much worse.
Do you know that
Yeah.
research, and I may be misquoting this, or this could even be an urban legend, but I think it's true. I think I read this somewhere. Um, it's about, you got a big jar full of marbles, and you ask people to guess how many marbles are in the jar. And if you ask, one or 10 or 20 people, they're wildly off. But when you get up to 500 or 1,000 guesses and you average them, they're incredibly accurate.
Yeah, yeah, it's called I think it's just called crowdsourcing, or there's maybe a more scientific name for that, but yeah. And that
I mean, when you apply that to democracy, because I look around and I say people are idiots and they're uninformed. Um, but if you apply that marble research, it seems like maybe that's the best way to make a decision. Hmm.